Right, welcome Beth to this OOT podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Do you want to kick off by talking a bit about your career history and your current role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I graduated from the University of East Anglia in 2005. Every time I say that, I have to recalculate how many years ago that was, and it gets a bit scary. I graduated in 2005, and I then went out into the world and I did my basic grade training at the time over in Tower Hamlets. From there, in paediatrics and children's services mainly, and that's where I've spent most of my career, within children's services of some kind, mainly working within education. And from there, I was really fortunate to spend some time in Cambodia working with Handicap International, then coming back working in other various children's services sort of across Harrow and Brent, then went off and spent some time in Vietnam for a couple of years working with voluntary services overseas, again working on developing children's services in Hanoi and surrounding areas. Came back again, more children's services. Most recently, I was, prior to coming to sensory integration, working from Buckinghamshire, managing the children's occupational therapy services there. And now I work for Sensory Integration Education. So we are a not-for-profit organisation, and our sole aim of our organisation is to provide training and support in the area of sensory integration and sensory processing. And I've been here full time as their programme facilitator since October last year. So my role is to work on our postgraduate programme, where we're training OT, speech therapists and therapists in becoming sensory integration practitioners, but also developing our lifelong learning programme and working on other projects such as our sensory inclusive schools and our sensory help now, which is our family support service.
Thanks, that sounds amazing. Are you able to talk a bit more about the projects you were doing in Cambodia and Vietnam?
Absolutely. So in Cambodia, that wasn't linked to sensory at all, but interest. I was working for a company called Handicap International, and that was on a cerebral palsy project. So in Cambodia, I was based in Siem Reap and Takao, a province kind of in the south of Cambodia, and my role was to work with their outreach workers who were going into the villages, working with children mainly with physical disabilities, and basically injecting a bit of OT in what they do. So how can they, in their rehab, based assistance? They were very much keen on developing motor skills, but my role was about, okay, how can we inject a little bit of occupational therapy in there? How can we look at dressing and feeding and toileting, and develop independence for these children with physical disabilities? And that was interesting because that was out in the provinces, in the middle of nowhere half the time, having to be on a bike for a couple of hours to actually get to the children and the young people, and really working with no resources, or the resources that were to hand. So for it was an occupational therapist dream. Okay, it really was work with the resources that you've got. Look at the environments that you have around you, and what do you have within this environment that actually we can help support this young person. So that was in Cambodia. As I said, mainly physical disability, cerebral palsy, lots of training around the importance of occupation and how we can support families in increasing independence in their young people. In Vietnam, it was slightly different. I was there working with voluntary services overseas, and this was a project to develop autism services within and around Hanoi. So I worked with a network of Vietnamese psychologists who were responsible for diagnosing autism along with other neurodevelopmental difficulties. And we looked at their assessment processes. We were increasing their knowledge of autism, and we also went out into a network of kind of local special schools, and we were doing teacher training about how they could make their schools more inclusive they're autistic students with quite profound and multiple needs. So there were two very, very different projects, but very interesting, and I'd highly recommend it to do. It was just such a fantastic learning experience and reflections that I draw on even now in my practice.
And was it that work in Vietnam that introduced you to sensory processing?
It was actually, because up until I went to Vietnam, a lot of the services I'd worked with in the UK were children's services, but were mainly physical based services. And back in kind of 2005, that kind of time, a lot of the NHS services were very much, for children's services, were you were either a physical service or a mental health service. And autism didn't, and sensory processing didn't really factor within our more physical delivery of services, if that makes sense. So yeah, I went to Vietnam, and it was a very inspirational speech and language therapist who was working there, an Australian speech and language therapist, and she had started to do some work around regulation. So how could she get some of these students to be calmer to come to her speech and language therapy sessions? And she introduced me to the concept of sensory processing there, and that was the first time I heard about it, and I could actually see it working in practice. And yeah, the rest is history. Then I came home from there and did my formal training in sensory integration and processing.
And for someone who's never heard of sensory processing before, how would you explain it?
So sensory processing, or sensory integration and processing, is the way that our nervous system receives and interprets information or sensory information from our environment, but also within our body. It's the way then the brain takes that information, interprets it, synthesizes it, and decides, what am I going to do about this? And decides on a response. So what is my motor response, or what is my behavioral response to this sensory input? So sensory integration and processing is something that happens at the level of the central nervous system, at the brain level. So when we work within this theory, it's very much based in neurology. And we are, when we're seeing behavior and we're seeing motor difficulties, if we're using this frame of reference, we're going to hypothesize that it's something to do with the integration or the processing of the senses, why this difficulty is occurring or presenting.
And am I right that you'd look at 7 different senses?
We look at 8 senses.
Oh.
Yes, so we do look at 8 senses. So we have our 7 senses where, so they, the theory of sensory integration and processing was developed by an occupational therapist called Dr. Jean Ayres in the 1970s and 80s, and she first put forward this theory. And indeed, you're right, she put forward the 7 senses she spoke about, which is the 5 that we all learn about at school, which is our vision, hearing, I'm going to get them all wrong now. Vision, hearing, touch, sight, taste and smell. Should have written them all down. And then the 2 that are, which is our sense of vestibular, or our sense of movement, and our proprioceptive sense, which is our sense of body awareness. But since then, this theory has evolved and it's developed since the 70s and 80s when Dr. Ayres was working on this, and now we include our sense of interoception as well into that as the 8th sense. So our sense of interoception is that internal body sense. It's our ability to sense those sensations within our body and put meaning to them. So for example, I can sense when you're hungry, when you're thirsty, when you're hot, when you need to go to the toilet, that's all senses from within our body telling us that. So that's our sense of interoception. So being able to recognize, oh, I've got a squishy feeling in my tummy, that must mean I need to go to the toilet. And then acting on that, that's our sense of interoception. So it's those 8 senses.
Thank you. And you mentioned vestibular is to do with movement. Are you able to talk a bit more about what vestibular is?
Absolutely. So our vestibular system, the receptors for our vestibular system are based within our inner ears. And the vestibular system is responsible for knowing, okay, what position is my head relation to gravity. So am I standing up? Am I laying down? Am I upside down? How fast, how slow am I going? It is responsible for balance, big role in posture. Balance, I say, is if you've ever had an ear infection and you feel like, oh, I'm really dizzy, that's because the receptors for your vestibular sense are they're kind of in there they're in your inner ear. So when you get that ear infection, you feel unstable and unbalanced. It's because it's wreaking havoc with your vestibular system. Your vestibular system also has a really important role in learning. So we need it for attention and concentration. It determines our levels of alertness or arousal. That's our movement system. And it also has a big role in controlling the small muscles of your eyes. So it allows me to keep my head still, and move my eyes side to side, but also to be able to move my eyes side to side and keep my head still. Really important for reading, looking across the page, or things like copying off the whiteboard. So our vestibular sense is really, really important for movement, posture, attention, and academic skills such as reading to control those movements of the eyes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another term that comes up a lot within sensory integration is the term of regulation.
Yes.
Are you able to talk about what regulation is?
Absolutely. So when we look at sensory processing integration, there's kind of two difficulties that occur. One with what we call regulation and the other with motor skills. So there's two kind of difficulties we can see. So if we take the regulation first, or the modulation. So this is the ability for your brain to adjust your kind of the level of alertness just right. So for example, what happens when we have difficulties with modulation is we can either interpret a sense as too little or too much. Okay, so when we interpret a sense as too little, that means normal stimulus, our body just isn't picking it up. Okay, so we don't respond to it. When we're over responding to a sense, it means that our brain is receiving or interpreting that information as, whoa, too much, this is too big, this is over the top. So a stimulus that you think shouldn't cause maybe upset, withdrawal, distress actually does. You know, someone just tapping me lightly on the shoulder, if I'm over responsive to that, I will interpret as that as someone hitting me. And as a result, my behavior will reflect that. I'll be like, oh, get away, go away, or I might run away, or I might even hit you back. I'm over responsive to that sense. So that's regulation, that ability, that over and that under responsiveness, and the ability to be kind of at that just right level.
Thank you. And how can sensory processing difficulties impact on people's occupations? Obviously, that's a massive question.
So as I said before, we can have kind of two categories maybe of difficulty. So this regulation piece, am I under or over responsive, but also this motor piece. So can I plan my movements? Do I have good posture? This piece as well comes with sensory processing. So if we take someone's occupation, for example, if I'm over responsive to something like touch, I might not be able to tolerate the touch of clothing on my skin. If I'm over responsive to sound, I may not want to go into that environment where it's noisy. So I may not want to go into the classroom. So I'll refuse to go. So it just prevents me from even engaging in an occupation. If I'm totally being dysregulated by my environment, everything's too much, too overwhelming. Again, we see people who just cannot participate in their occupations at all. From the motor perspective, I think maybe we might be a bit more familiar with that. Again, sensory processing has impacts on not only the motor performance, but the praxis, the actually planning of motor skills. So again, we're going to see that people are not going to be able to plan how they dress. They're not going to be able to plan how they cook a meal. They may not have the right enough postural control to do things like stand up and put their trousers on. So it can absolutely impact every aspect of your occupational performance and engagement.
Thank you. So you're currently working in schools with it. What sort of work are you doing with schools to make them more sensory inclusive?
So we are looking at supporting all we're in sensory inclusive schools, our project. We are looking at supporting all students' unique sensory profiles, okay, because at a universal level, because if we can make the classrooms and the learning accessible for everyone's sensory profiles, and everyone will benefit from them. So that is largely looking at environments. So how can we adapt environments to make them more sensory inclusive? Now that will be unique to everyone's unique sensory profile, because we all have our own unique sensory profiles. But there are some overarching principles, like looking at the lighting, looking at the sound, looking at the a lot of schools will have lots of displays that are quite colourful and cluttered. Actually, can we reduce that visual stimulus to support students? Looking at the layout of the classroom, is there too much furniture around, so students with motor difficulties can plan their way through the class better? Can we introduce things like movement breaks throughout the whole school day for everyone? Can we give all students lots of opportunity for regulating activities, such as proprioceptive activities, throughout the day, so everyone benefits from the opportunity to regulate? So it's very much, our project is looking at supporting the whole school or whole classes at that universal level of support.
And so recognizing that some of those children might not have what you've got, a sensory profile with strong needs, but they might still react to certain stimuli like light or sound.
Absolutely.
And then they're going to grow up and be adults. What works in place, do you know, or what should be done for adults in work environments, public spaces, to look at sensory needs?
There's a lot of really nice work going on at the moment around this by other people, such as Sensory Street, looking at adult environments. Absolutely, it's a big drive within the NHS at the moment, and they have actually produced their sensory strategy as well. But absolutely the same principles apply. We all are sensory beings. We all have a unique sensory profiles that remain with us throughout the lifespan. You're absolutely right. We don't just grow out of sensory processing, or we don't just grow out of our unique sensory profiles. They remain with us. So the same principles would apply. But what we have as adults is more degree of choice. Yeah, we can choose maybe where we go and where we don't go. We can choose the clothes that we wear. Whereas when we're working with students in schools, for example, that choice is limited. You go to your classroom, you go to your school, you wear your school uniform. There's not a lot of choice. For example, my unique sensory profile means I cannot tolerate, the corduroy fabric.
Yes.
Well, the sensation of that makes me feel unwell just to think about it. My emotional response to that sensation causes me to feel nausea. That is a physiological response as a result of my unique profile. Now, as an adult, I have choice. I don't have to wear corduroy. My kids have never had those lovely dungarees, those cute dungarees made out of corduroy fabric. I can't stand it. If that had been my school uniform, I would refused to have put that school uniform on. I would have been a school refuser, just because the thought of that sensation is so overwhelming for me. And even if you had got me into that school uniform, I would have been so preoccupied all day with how uncomfortable I was to have that against my skin. I would not be paying attention to anything else around me. Now, as an adult, I can choose not to sit next to someone who's wearing corduroy trousers. You know, don't be offended if you're in a staff meeting with me and I move away from you, because I can do that. But students and schools don't, and that's why we're seeing more and more school refusal, especially that are linked in some way to sensory processing. That wasn't quite the question you asked. I know we've diverted around there, but yeah, adults absolutely, and you can probably reflect yourself, because our sensory profiles, they impact on everything we do and we choose. They are part of our personality in some respects. You know, we will choose leisure activities based on our sensory preferences. When you're dysregulated or stressed out, you've got activities that you go to, that you choose. Like you might go to gym, or you might go for a swim, or you go for a massage. Your sensory preferences or your sensory profile is determine all of that. We can't separate ourselves from our sensory profiles. That they are core to who we are, and we don't grow out of that. And you know, people, there's this discussion around, well, is there something wrong with that person? Are they difficulties? But we all process the world in very different ways. Our sensory systems process informations uniquely, but the barriers are put in front of us when other people don't appreciate that unique profile. So it is definitely not something wrong with the person and their sensory processing. It's because the environment and the people around them don't understand, and that's where the barriers to participation arise from.
And do you think most of the OT jobs working in sensory integration, do they tend to be with children or with clients with autism, or are there other client groups that the OTs work with?
I think historically it's been children, because when Dr. Ayres was working, she was working with children and young people. So historically that's where it was, but absolutely that is not the case now. I think we have got increasing evidence that sensory processing differences occur across the lifespan, across different clinical populations. So we are now seeing therapists using a sensory integration and processing lens across the lifespan, because the evidence is there. Sensory processing impacts function and participation across the lifespan, and it's in key populations we know. So we know, especially in adult populations who are suffering with depression and anxiety, especially in more research is coming out now about dementia and the link with sensory processing and integration. So it's definitely from cradle to grave. Occupational therapists should be aware of the impact that sensory processing and integration has on occupational performance.
And with dementia, is that, do you think, because of changes that are happening in the brain, that's going to change how people perceive the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got actual neurological changes that are happening. So we need to be aware of that. And I think we need to be aware that some of the behaviours we may be seeing dementia traditionally can be put down to more what I label the behavioural outcomes of dementia. So, you know, rather than thinking, could this be a sensory? So, for example, maybe a client who's being hoisted and they get agitated maybe when they're being hoisted. Let's not label this as a pure behavioural response. Could it be that their vestibular system, due to the natural process of aging, due to the impact of dementia, that we're now seeing differences occurring within their vestibular system, and they're actually experiencing distress. That's why we're seeing this behaviour. So it's really encouraging us to refine and reflect on behaviour across the lifespan using this lens, using this sensory lens. Yes.
And what are some of the options in that situation of someone that's being hoisted?
So for So, for example, if I've done my sensory assessment and I do think this is maybe a vestibular discrimination or a vestibular reactivity difficulty, I may decide, okay, I know with my sensory training, I can maybe do some calming activities before we hoist them. So actually, do we do some proprioception before we hoist, or maybe during hoisting? Do I do some deep touch tactile pressure in preparation for the hoist? Actually, does this person need more movement in their day? So actually, are we seeing a decline in this vestibular functioning? Because what happens with a lot of elderly people with dementia, they become immobile, don't they? They don't move, or they don't have the opportunity for movement. So actually, take the hoist away. What I need to do is make sure that this person has more movement throughout the course of their day. So I'll be looking at ways that I can support their nervous system remain regulated throughout the transfer. And we do that supporting regulation by proprioception, deep touch pressure, and other calming sensory inputs we know. But I'm also going to be trying to still give them that vestibular input that brain needs to still keep forming those adaptive responses. So I'm still going to try and give them that opportunity for movement throughout the day as well. And then we hope that that makes that hoisting a more pleasant experience for that person, rather than labeling that behavior as being awkward or difficult and we never address it, but actually this is a person in distress.
That's really interesting. I've heard as well about I think it was in Pentonville prison having they've got a neurodiverse wing, and they've made one of their prison cells into a sensory safe room. There's a I think it's on BBC Sounds, there's a 5-minute talk about that, and they're talking about just how loud the environment is. There's banging of the doors and the clanging of the keys, and that's an environment where adults haven't got that choice that you were talking about.
Absolutely. Same on the acute hospital wards as well. The same. If you think of, again, anywhere where you've got that lack of choice, or that's an issue. But we see it the same, especially on those acute mental health wards, as you said, that the clanging of the keys, the banging of the door, the alarms that go off. It can really put people into that fight or flight response. And when we're really dysregulated and we are in fight, flight, or freeze, our brain goes into survival mode. So when the brain feels it's under threat, under attack from its sensory surroundings, it'll do everything it can to protect itself, which it is your fight. I'm going to fight the stimulus, I'm going to run away from it, flight, or I'm going to freeze. Now, when you're in a prison environment, when you're in a hospital environment, the easiest thing to do is flight. You don't have the opportunity for flight. So what you tend to do is fight. And we see then behaviours to keep ourselves safe. We may physically fight, we may verbally fight, but we see that I need the stimulus to go away. So what these rooms are doing is giving the opportunity for flight. I feel dysregulated, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't really want to fight you. I need somewhere to go where I can flee to, and then I can regulate and I can calm and I can feel safe again.
Thank you.
And I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, the prison staff in this recording were just saying how well it works and how much calmer the prisoners have been.
Given the opportunity to fly. And we do that in the classrooms as well. There's lots of students that, again, they're labelled as sometimes, I hate using the word, but sometimes like aggressive, because their response, they physically, I'm going to fight this stimulus is so overwhelming. But give them the opportunity for flight, and that doesn't have to be flight out of the classroom. It could be, I have one student that his flight path is he'll go under the table. The teacher will put a cover over the table, and he's got his little den under there where he can regulate. But he knows that when things are getting overwhelming, he has somewhere to go that's a sensory safe place. And again, that's what the prisons are offering, that sensory safe place that people can go to. Yeah.